Hello and welcome to this demo on using breakpoints in UiPath Studio. In this video, we'll learn about the various ways of toggling breakpoints, using the breakpoints panel, and creating conditional breakpoints, trace points, and conditional trace points. We're using the same project from the debugging interface video with one small change. We've removed the surrounding sequences for the type into activities to simplify the process. As a quick recap, our workflow reads employee data from an Excel file with 5 entries, opens a browser window, navigates to a web form, and iterates through each row of the data table, entering the employee information into the form. Before we get into the details, let's start with a few definitions. Breakpoints are used to pause the debugging process on an activity which may cause execution issues. Note that a breakpoint will break the execution before running the activity, or the container that holds it. Setting a condition or a hit count turns a simple breakpoint into a conditional breakpoint. Adding logging to a simple breakpoint turns it into a simple trace point, while adding logging to a conditional breakpoint turns it into a conditional trace point. It's useful to know that for trace points, we can disable pausing the execution and use them for logging purposes only while in debug mode. Let's see breakpoints in action. We'll run the workflow in debug mode and pause the execution. We want to add a simple breakpoint on the type into, enter, first name activity. First, let's select it. One way of toggling a breakpoint is to click the Breakpoints button in the Debug ribbon, or to use the keyboard shortcut F9. We can see the simple enabled breakpoint as a full red dot in the Designer panel, and we can find more details in the Breakpoints panel. Next, we want to toggle another breakpoint on the Type into email address activity. Another way to do this is by right-clicking the activity and selecting the Toggle Breakpoint option. Clicking the Toggle Breakpoint option again disables the breakpoint. Note the change in the icon when a breakpoint is disabled. Let's toggle another breakpoint on the Type into city, state, zip activity. Great, we've set all of the breakpoints that we need for this demo. Let's explore the Breakpoints panel. It displays all of the breakpoints in the current project, along with the file in which they're contained, conditions, and log messages. In the Breakpoints panel menu, we have the options of deleting a breakpoint, deleting all breakpoints, enabling all breakpoints, or disabling all breakpoints. Right-clicking a breakpoint will open a context menu. Here, we can delete the breakpoint, or we can focus on it. Note that the focus in the Designer panel has changed from the Type into city, state, zip activity to the Type into first name activity. Let's do it again. Now the focus has changed to the Type into email address activity. We also have the options of enabling or disabling the breakpoint here. We can also access breakpoint settings, but we'll talk about this a bit later. One last thing. Double-clicking a breakpoint will change the focus to that breakpoint. Now that we've set our breakpoints and we've explored the Breakpoints panel, let's run the workflow in debug mode and see what happens. The workflow is executing, and we've just reached our first breakpoint. Note that the execution has entered a paused state, and the sequence holding the breakpoint, type into first name, hasn't been executed. This is a good time to explore the various panels in the debugging interface to identify potential issues and test solutions. We'll click Continue. The execution will continue past the disabled breakpoint on the Type into email address activity. The robot is running the activities and entering the data. Okay, it stopped before entering the city, state, zip value into the form. Alright, it's time to showcase the creation of a conditional breakpoint. We can also work with breakpoints outside of debug mode. We'll click Stop to exit debug mode and access the Breakpoints panel in design mode. Let's right-click on the Type into First Name breakpoint to bring up the context menu. We can access a breakpoint settings by clicking the Settings option in the context menu, or by clicking the gear icon to the right-hand side of the breakpoints row. Let's click Settings. The condition field lets us enter a Boolean expression. If the condition is met during debugging, the execution breaks and the activity is highlighted. The hit count field specifies the number of times the condition must be met before the execution breaks. The log message field specifies the message to be logged at trace level when the condition is met. Or if no condition is set, the message is logged when the execution reaches the trace point. By enabling the Continue Execution when logging checkbox, the execution won't be paused when the specified message is logged. It's available only if a log message was previously set. Trace points are useful to replace log message and write-line activities used for debugging purposes. We want to turn this simple breakpoint into a conditional breakpoint, so we'll add a condition and a hit count. In the condition field, let's enter current row of first name to string equals Greg. Let's enter 2 in the hit count field. This means that the second time the breakpoint is hit and the value of the first name variable is Greg, it'll break the execution. Let's click OK. The icon has changed in the Designer panel and the Breakpoints panel, indicating that this is a conditional breakpoint. Let's select the second breakpoint and go to Settings. We want to configure it as a simple trace point. Let's add a message in the log message field. We have reached the email input sequence. This trace point will log the message when hit, and it'll pause the execution. Let's click OK. The simple trace point icon looks like this. Next, we'll turn the last breakpoint into a conditional trace point. We'll add the condition current row of city state zip to string contains Washington. We'll add a hit count of 2, and for the message, let's add an expression. First name plus space plus last name plus is from Washington. We'll enable Continue Execution when logging. This means that the second time when execution reaches the breakpoint and the city state zip variable contains the substring Washington, the conditional trace point will log a message with the employee's full name and the string is from Washington, but it won't break the execution. Okay, we're done here. Let's run the workflow in debug mode and see them in action. Note that it didn't pause before typing the first name Greg since the hit count is set to 2. It entered the last name and it paused before entering the email address. Let's check the trace point settings. The Continue Execution when logging checkbox is disabled, so the execution pauses whenever it reaches this activity. Let's enable the checkbox. In the next iterations, the execution will log the message, but it won't pause on this activity. Let's click OK and continue. The workflow continues to enter data into the fields. We've just started the second iteration. And now we're on the third one. The fourth iteration. And we've just started the fifth iteration. The first name for the fifth entry in our data table is Greg. This means that the condition for the first breakpoint is met, so the execution has entered a paused state. This is a good time to check the logs in the output panel. Note how the message "We have reached the email input sequence" has been logged for every iteration. Also, the type into city, state, zip conditional trace point has been logged for the values in that data table row. Richard Dempsey is from Washington. The execution is paused on the type into first name activity on the 5th iteration. Let's check the condition. If we click Continue, the execution will run to the end. The execution was successful, and we can see this in the output panel as well. This concludes our demo on breakpoints. Let's recap. Breakpoints are used to pause the debugging process on an activity which may cause execution issues. A breakpoint will pause the execution before running the activity or the container that holds it. They don't affect execution in run mode. A conditional breakpoint is a simple breakpoint with a condition or a hit count. A simple trace point is a simple breakpoint with logging. A conditional trace point is a conditional breakpoint with logging. We recommend that you take some time to explore using breakpoints in your own debugging process. We're confident that doing so will enhance your overall debugging experience. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.